Well, I have to say, if you've made it this far in this beginner series, job well done already, because we have gone over a lot of new concepts, and if this is your first time learning to code, you're doing a great job. It's really important to remember as you're learning how to code, really learning anything new, but especially something like this that has a million things to understand. It's really important to be kind to yourself. So if there's been anything so far that has been confusing or overwhelming, or you just don't get it, that is okay. You can rewatch these videos, you can do some Google searching, you can sleep on it, which is a surprisingly effective way to fix a bug in your code. But just be kind to yourself, and there's a lot to learn. It's really gonna be okay. So there's my little pep talk for the day. In this video, we're going to implement our focus screen. So far, we've just had our list of tasks here, and we can add a new task. But over in our design, we had the focus screen concept where we could switch tabs and put ourselves in a focus mode, being able to just look at one task at a time. So let's jump right in. The first thing we're going to do is we have this one render function, which renders our top line of text. It maps over our tasks in this array, joins them together into a string, and it puts all of this into our element that has the ID of screen, which is this div tag in our HTML. That's what generates all of this content. But in the focus screen, we don't have this task input or this task button. So if we were to add tabs at the top, we don't want to have this input and button remain there. We want those to disappear. So what we're going to do is we're going to move this HTML content really up here into this screen div. Now, we can't do exactly this because I'll show you. If I save and refresh, that input and button goes away. Even though it's in our HTML code here, because this render function is running, it is wiping out whatever is in the inner HTML and replacing it with what we're generating in JavaScript. The point of moving this in here is that we want to use this screen div element to either render our task list or render our focus view. So I want this input and button to conditionally be inserted in here. So instead of defining this in our HTML, I'm actually going to move this down into our JavaScript. So right here where we're generating our HTML string, I'm going to get rid of our semicolon here, and you can just continue on to the next line if you're concatenating strings with pluses with additional pluses. So I have a plus here, and then I have a string where I'm just putting in HTML code. And then I'm going to do another plus here and a string where I'm putting in HTML code. Then I'm going to end that with a semicolon. Let me save here. I'll save our JavaScript and our HTML file, and I'll refresh over here, and now we have this appearing in here once again. Now this looks kind of dirty. I would never do this as a professional software developer. We're gonna get a little further down the way and clean this up a bit. It's a bit nasty to have our HTML with little attributes inside of them and child content and all this sort of stuff to find in a string. But we're gonna get a little further down the road and clean this up a bit later. For now, I really just want to drive home the fact that within this render function, this is where we are rendering our list. In fact, I'm going to rename this function to render list, and then we're going to create another function called render focus to render our focus view. So I could come in here and just rename this to render list. But there are a couple of different places in our code where we are referencing this. We are creating this render list variable here, which is a function, and calling that function down here, but then we're also calling it here in our onClick handler for the button. Because we're referencing this in multiple places, I don't want a rename of this function to break our code. So there's a trick here in VS Code where if you use F2, the key on your keyboard, F2, you can rename this. So I'll say rename this to render list, and it will automatically rename this everywhere this is used in your code. So it has renamed it in both of these places for us. That's pretty cool. So let me save this, refresh again just to make sure it's working. I can add a task here, click our button. Excellent. But wait a second. I just added this task, but if I try to add another task, suddenly our code breaks. Why is that? Well, if we look here, remember anything that is outside of a function in our JavaScript code here runs when the page loads. So I have this const button where I'm grabbing the button from our page and assigning an onClick handler to it. But every time we re-render this list, it's actually generating a new button element. So the first time we add a task, it re-renders correctly, it adds the task, but it also re-renders that input and the button, and those are, even though they look the same, actually new elements on the page. So because of that, we need to reassign that onClick handler every time we regenerate that button. So let me come here and I'm going to cut and paste. I'm going to move this code that defines our button handler and move it into our render function. So right after we set the HTML, I'm going to move this code in here to where once we generate our new HTML and place it on the screen, we can then go fetch that button and assign it an onClick handler. So if I save this and refresh, I should be able to add our first task, hit add, and then our second task, and hit add again, and that works just fine. Okay, so now we have one function, render list, which will take this empty screen div element and populate it with our HTML, our input, our button, assign our button handler, everything that we need for that list view. Now let's create a focus view where it will show just one of our tasks at a time. So we have our render list function here. I'm going to, there's this special thing here in VS Code, this arrow next to const render list. I can collapse that function just to hide away its inner parts for now. I'm going to create a new function called render focus. So we'll have our parentheses for inputs, our fat arrow, and our curly braces, just like all of our other functions. In this function, we want to show one task. So we have our tasks array up top here, which has all of our tasks that we start with by default, as well as any new tasks that we add onto the screen. Let's grab one of those elements from that array. Let's just grab the first one. So I'm going to do task, const task. We're going to assign this to a variable. How we can get one of the elements out of an array is by using our square brackets, because it's an array. Ooh, that is plural. We can use our square brackets because it's an array, and then reference it by a number. Now, remember, the number 1 is not the first task, because in computer science, most things start at 0. So I'm going to use a 0 there in order to grab that first task. So this would be, for right now, download VS Code. So this is now going to be a string, which is our first task. Now let's take that task and push it to our view here in the browser, or our screen. Now where will we do this? This div that we have in our HTML is just an empty div. We're really using it as our placeholder to render our two different views, either the list or the focus view. So what we can do is take this task and put it inside this div. Here in our render list function, we used document.getElementById to get a reference to that screen div in our HTML. We can do the exact same thing in our render focus function. In fact, instead of doing this here inside of render list, because we just kind of need it everywhere, we need it in both functions, I'm going to move this outside of that function so we can use it in both. So now that screen is defined out here, I can use it both in our render list function, but also in our render focus function. Now if I do screen.inner text, remember we've used inner HTML and inner text. We use inner HTML when we're assigning it a string that contains HTML code. But we're using inner text when we're assigning it a string that is just meant to be words and characters. So we're going to use inner text here. So if I use screen.innerText and assign that to my task, that will place this text inside of our screen div. Now, how do we get this to actually function? We're going to cheat for just a moment and render our focus view by default. So right here on render list, we are defining this function and calling it immediately when the page loads. Instead of doing that, let's call our render focus function. Something very common that developers use is to comment code out. You can add comments in your code to either help document things or to stop some code from running temporarily. So if I go to the beginning of this line and put 2 forward slashes, this is now commented out and it's just treated as superfluous words. It means nothing and this won't run as code. So now at the bottom here, I can do render focus, use parentheses to call that function, and if I save and refresh, now I only have one task, and that comes from this render focus code running. So in order to swap between these two different views, let's place 2 buttons at the top of our screen and use those buttons to switch between list and focus. So I'm going to go in our HTML here and we're going to create 2 buttons. So button, we'll say list, and then I'm going to create another button with focus. If I refresh, then now I have 2 buttons up here at the top. Now why did those buttons not go away even though we're replacing the screen content? Well, that's because whenever we do screen.innerText or screen.innerHTML, it's not replacing the whole page, it's just replacing what's inside this div. So anything outside this div, like these 2 buttons, are just fine, they remain. Now let's create 2 onClick handlers that we can use whenever we click each of these buttons to call each of our render functions. In order to do that, we'll need some way to reference these buttons. So I will make an ID on each of these. So we have list, list tab, we'll call that list tab, and then we'll call this focus tab. Now in our code, we can use document.getElementById to get a reference to each of those buttons. So let's say list tab is document.getElementById of list tab, and then focus tab is document.getElementById focus tab. Make sense? Now we can say for our list tab on click function, we want to create a function that then calls render list. And that's all that function's going to do. And for our focus button, we want focus tab dot on click. Whenever we click the button labeled focus, we want it to render our focus view. So if we click list, it runs our render list function. If we click focus, it runs our render focus function. Now, by default, we want to show our list view whenever the page loads. So I'm going to remove where we're calling render focus whenever the page loads and uncomment out our render list. Now if I save our HTML and refresh, now we have our list view once again. We have our add task elements down here, and we have our list and focus views. So if I click focus, it replaces our content with the focus view. And if I click list, it goes back to the list. Now let's see something pretty cool here. Let's say I add a 5th task. So here's our 5th task in the list. I've clicked add. Now if I go to focus, that 5th task has gone away, but it is still stored inside of our tasks variable. We haven't refreshed the page, we haven't reset anything here. It's still stored in our code even though we can't see it on the screen. So when I click list, it actually reappears here even though we switched views. So that's pretty cool. So to sum this up, we created 2 functions, render list and render focus. The jobs of those functions are to generate the content, be it HTML or text, that needs to be inserted inside of our screen div here. And via JavaScript and the logic that we've created, it generates all of the HTML that gets placed on our page. We added 2 buttons up top, which calls one of those 2 functions and allows us to swap between different views of our page using the same data. Now, crack your knuckles. In our next episode, we're going to make another big jump. Now that we have 2 views being contained within our code, and we have all of the logic to render these and handle all the button clicks and elements, our code is honestly getting a little unwieldy here. We have a lot of things going on. We're adding IDs in our HTML and then referencing those down in our JavaScript. We're creating LI tags that show up in the view, but actually don't see any LI tags in our code visually. It would be nicer if we could break this up and have some sort of framework to do some of the common things that we need to do when building interfaces in a browser. Luckily, there is a fantastic framework out there called React. React is a framework for building interfaces, and it allows us to do a lot of the common things that we need, like breaking things into multiple views, handling re-renders, handling updating our content when our data changes, like a list of tasks. So this will be a great time to level up and introduce React into our code. But before we do that, we need to set up our development environment and get that ready for creating a React project. And that's what we'll do in our next video. I'll see you there.